As I was considering doing a sermon series on the 7 deadly sins, I was always feeling a little awkward about doing a sermon on gluttony. An obese man is probably not going to have a lot of authority to speak on this. But as I dug into the other 7 sins, I realized that I'm probably no more prone to gluttony than I am to the other sins. You see, the name deadly sin seems to imply that these are somehow the worst sins. But it's really about showing how these sins are the sins that we can easily excuse despite the fact that they still have serious consequences in our lives. It's also true that these are the kinds of sins that we can carry out that maybe we can convince ourselves that we don't struggle with. I can tell myself that I'm not proud, especially compared to those people over there. I can convince myself that I'm not lustful because I don't look at porn, but if I'm still categorizing people by how attractive or unattractive they are, then maybe I am. I can convince myself that I don't have a problem with anger because all the people that I'm angry with are people who deserve my anger. So all of this to say is that the deadly sins are unlike other sins like piracy or arson because we can easily rationalize them in our lives. Now, I realize that I'm proud, envious, lustful, greedy, and angry, as well as being a glutton. And I'm sure next week I will discover the depth of my own sloth. Now, all of this is to say that we probably all struggle with these sins on some level. The point is not for us to excuse these sins, but neither is it for us to become overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness, like saying, well, this is all I am and all I ever will be. When we come face to face with the depth of our sinfulness, there's good news. God's grace is bigger than our sin. If we seek God's grace, we can find freedom, although becoming free isn't a one and done thing, but a discipline in which we constantly come to God for grace, and that grace takes root and grows in our lives. So if this discussion about sin hits a little close to home, the point isn't to make you feel bad about it. The point is to remind us that we must live in a posture of openness to God's grace so that we can learn to be obedient. Now, before we get talking about gluttony, we really should define what we're talking about. To understand what gluttony is, we should look at the other deadly sins because they can help us understand. Because many of these sins are about a disordering of desires. It means taking a good thing that God has given us and turning it into an idol in our lives. So desiring for our material needs to be met is not a bad thing. But when our material needs become the center of our lives, then we're behaving greedily. Sexual desire within the confines of marriage is a good thing, but if we elevate sexual desire to be the center of our life, then we're behaving lustfully. Gluttony is a disordered desire for food and drink. It's what happens when we make these things too important in our lives. For example, a person who comforts themselves by eating or drinking is behaving gluttonously. Now, I have to cop to this one. I learned to overeat as a child. We moved out of town to a country area where I had to go to a new school and where I didn't connect with my classmates. They didn't like me very much, and I found that I could deal with the stress this caused me by overeating, which of course set a pattern in my life. And at other times of stress or even boredom, then I might start to eat to make myself feel better. So when we had the twins and things were really stressful, or during the pandemic or whatever, we can deal with stress by going to God, or we can go to other things like eating or drinking too much, but those things don't help us and can cause us long-term care or long-term harm. But it's not those who just overeat that have a disordered relationship to food. So do people who obsess about what they don't eat. I remember when I was in journalism school, I was interviewing a lady who was a sports nutritionist, who I think was really, she had an axe to grind because she hadn't been hired by the local junior hockey team to oversee the nutrition of the team players. And she was talking about how even just eating a single cheeseburger would ruin the competitiveness of the team through the entire season, and how they needed her to help them sort this sort of stuff out. And I think she was just trying to justify why she would charge them money to do this. But what she was advocating, I think, is a disordered relationship to food. Of course, athletes would need to be selective about what they eat in order to maximize their competitive advantage, but not to the extent where they could never even have a cheeseburger over the course of a year. So a person who is that concerned with not eating certain things or only eating other things can have a disordered relationship to food. Now, I do want to qualify this to say that there are people who go to great lengths to avoid eating certain types of food for legitimate medical reasons, like allergies or sensitivities. And I'm not talking about that. So the person who obsesses over what they eat or what they don't, unless there are legitimate reasons, is behaving gluttonously. Food is a good gift from God, and it is meant to be enjoyed, or else God would not have created so many delicious things in this world. But like all good gifts that God has given, when we focus on the gift to the exclusion of the giver, it becomes an idol. So gluttony is not just a simple imbalance between calories ingested and expended. So every person who maybe is a little heavier than they should be isn't necessarily a glutton. This is especially true in the reality of our modern Canadian food economy, because in a much different economy, that might be a little different. Throughout most of human history, there hasn't been enough food to go around. A lack of modern farming technology meant that only a small portion of the land was suitable for agriculture, and yields were very low. The scarcity, of course, was made worse by economic inequality because a relatively small elite would eat an outsized amount of the food. So for example, in Jesus' time and place, it's estimated that the top 10% consumed about 50% of the total calories. So when someone ate more than was necessary, they were creating further scarcity that could actually be deadly to another person. But modern farming technology has sort of changed this. Farming no longer takes 90% of the population, it takes 2%. And we produce large food surpluses. So what if we reduced our caloric intake to the bare minimum and were better about managing food waste? Well, the food prices would decrease, making it less profitable for farmers to grow food in a high-cost environment like Canada, which would probably result in less land coming under cultivation, which would then raise food prices until they hit that equilibrium that makes them profitable. So the decrease in demand would probably just result in a decrease in supply. Solving the economics of hunger isn't as easy as just reducing what we eat. So gluttony is not a sin, because by saying yes to dessert, I'm sentencing a child somewhere overseas to die a death of starvation. Rather, gluttony is a sin because in food we try to find the things that we are meant to receive from God. A story to help illustrate this. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, immediately after his baptism, the Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness for a period of fasting and prayer. We pick up the story in Matthew 4, verses 2 to 4. It says, "After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus was hungry. And the tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread.' Jesus answered, 'It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God.'" So for Jesus to change these stones into bread would be gluttonous, not because he doesn't need the calories, but because he would be using food to get what God intended Jesus to get from him. It would be to make food more important than the God who provides the food. Of course, Jesus' refusal to yield to this temptation is intended to contrast with the Israelites' behavior when they had food-related issues also in the wilderness. Read with me in Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 1. "The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had left Egypt." Calculate just how long 15 days in the second month would be. "In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, 'If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death.'" So like Jesus, the Israelites had been wandering around the desert at this point for right about 40 days. But unlike Jesus, they complain that God is trying to starve them. Jesus patiently accepts the privation because it is God's will. While the Israelites complain, God is gracious to them and provides them with manna, but the people still aren't satisfied with what God has given them. A little while later, we read, this is from Numbers 21:5, the Israelite assembly spoke against God and Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." Of course, they're talking about the manna. Now, I have to empathize with the Israelites a little bit here. If I had to eat a single food day in and day out for years on end, I think I'd be pretty sick of it too. But the people don't see God's grace in providing them with food. Instead, they focused on what they want rather than what he has given them. Who knows what might have happened if they had handled it differently? What if they'd gone to Moses and said, "Moses, can you talk to God for us and say, God, thank you so much for faithfully providing for our needs. But while you're there, could you also say, but you have created so many wonderful and tasty things in this world. Would it be possible, maybe, for you to provide some more variety in our diet while we're out in the wilderness? Thank you for what you've done. This would just make us so much more grateful." Maybe it was their attitude of entitlement rather than their desire for new flavors that really was the problem. But compared to the Israelites, Jesus focuses on God, obeying God's call to deny himself for a time. The Israelites become angry and entitled when God places them in a position to deny themselves. The Israelites focused on the gift, while Jesus focuses on the giver. Now, the lessons that we take away from Jesus' example shouldn't be that we should always fast, that we need never to eat or drink. After all, Jesus regularly feasts with his disciples, so much so that some people critique him of being a glutton and a drunkard. Jesus, though, eats in celebration with others. Food is a tool for sustaining his body and for building a community that celebrates and remembers what God has done. The food's never the point itself. Now, at this point, I want to mention how gluttony touches up against some touchy subjects, most notably eating disorders and alcohol consumption. My point here is not to shame people who suffer from addictions, but to point to a more hopeful future. People with eating disorders may experience those disorders for any number of reasons. Maybe it's low self-esteem or grief, a need for control, or distorted body image. And I don't mean to stigmatize, but to point out that these disorders are probably a symptom of a deeper spiritual or emotional reality, and that these spiritual and emotional realities should drive us to prayer. Now, praying is not a magic fix-all where we just painlessly shed our stress, but it is the first and a very important step in a healing journey. So we must pray. But please understand, I'm not saying, well, if you just prayed, God would take this away from you. But rather, hand it over to God and walk with him, and he will bring healing to your life, even if that healing happens on a far more gradual time frame than we would choose for ourselves. Now, alcohol addiction also grows out of a disordered relationship with food and drink. It's not that alcohol is strictly forbidden, but it's easily abused. The possibility of fermenting food to create alcohol is something that God built into creation. And the scriptures acknowledge that wine can bring joy. So, for example, in Psalm 104, it says, "He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens the human heart, oil that makes their faces shine, and bread that sustains their hearts." And of course, we see wine is a symbol of celebration in the life of Jesus. Very early in his ministry, Jesus and his disciples are invited to a wedding, and partway through the wedding celebration, the wine runs out, which is a huge faux pas in that culture. Jesus, encouraged by his mother, has them bring some water, which he transforms into wine. And not cheap wine, like the very best wine. So obviously Jesus wants this celebration to continue, and he thinks that the wine is an important part of that. Of course, we should also consider the use of the wine in the Last Supper. At the Last Supper, Jesus invests wine, this symbol of celebration, with an additional meaning. It is his blood. By bringing together this symbol of celebration with a symbol of his sacrificial death, Jesus is pointing to a reality that through his blood, we can be reconciled to God, and that is something worth celebrating. Yet to follow Jesus' example means that wine must be about relationships. It enhances relationships with other people with whom we are celebrating God's goodness. It's never about the wine itself. When my hope is in the wine, this becomes problematic. First, for the same reason that eating too much becomes problematic, because a created thing cannot do for us what God alone can do. But in the case of alcohol, there's an additional layer of difficulty. While wine can be a part of our celebration and enhance relationships, if we indulge too freely in the wine, our uninhibited selves can actually damage rather than enhance those relationships. Which is why Paul tells the believers, do not get drunk with wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Holy Spirit. When we consume enough alcohol that we're no longer in control of ourselves, we make decisions that we are going to regret. Paul instead admonishes us to be controlled by the Spirit. That's quite a contrast. Imagine a person who goes to a party and drinks too much, and over the course of their drunkenness, they say and do things that they later see with regret. And they might explain what happened and say, oh, the drink made me do it. Now imagine instead if somebody goes to a party and spends all their time saying things that are kind and encouraging to other people. So much so that it almost seems like it's not even them. And they could say, you know what? It was the Spirit doing it. How much better would our relations be if it was the Spirit driving our actions rather than the drink? But just as in the case of eating disorders, alcohol addiction is something that we need to take to God to help find healing. And just like with eating disorders, healing may take a great deal of time and effort, including false starts and do-overs before we find healing. But God is gracious. And if we seek God rather than the gifts of food and drink, we will find a greater blessedness in the long term, even if in the short term, denying ourselves feels a bit like a slog. Now I want to take some time and talk about some modern analogs of gluttony. These are things that basically, though they present with different issues, they're really underlying them is the same basic tendency. The same tendency to look to a thing to give us meaning in times of stress and uncertainty rather than a thing. And I want to look at two of them that couldn't have possibly been included in the list of deadly sins because they weren't even possibilities when these lists were being put together. The first of these is shopping. Now, of course, we all have to buy things. That's not a problem. I'm talking about the kind of shopping where we buy things just to make ourselves feel better, what some people call retail therapy. This happens when we use the novelty of acquiring something new to buoy our spirits in the face of stress or grief or boredom. Now, obviously, engaging in retail therapy can have significant financial consequences. But again, like gluttony, it channels our holy content that we experience into places in our lives that offer an immediate gratification, but can't actually give us long-term relief. And so these stresses are things that we can only take to God to take care of. So getting the latest fashions and the newest tech, as good as that might feel at the time, doesn't give us lasting peace in a stressful world. And the second analog of gluttony that I want to touch on is entertainment. Movie, TVs, books, these things can be great. I mean, stories are an important part of what it means to be a human. Stories help us relate to people whose life experiences are very different from ours. And good stories can really help us wrestle with difficult questions and come to an understanding with greater nuance of these things. And, you know, our culture does produce some of these things. But if we're really honest, maybe most of the stories that we're looking at are really about nothing more than providing an escape. Whether it's people fighting the zombie apocalypse or a new spy thriller or an historical drama about beautiful people courting at court. Much of the media that we consume is about nothing more than diversion. So when we're stressed out or sad, binging a show on Netflix may feel like a welcome distraction. But if stress is meant to push us to pray, then we're avoiding doing what can actually help us in the long run with something that is temporary and ultimately an unsatisfying relief. So if becoming over-focused on food or drink or things like shopping and entertainment is a vice, what's the corresponding virtue that helps us to offset the damage here? Well, that virtue is a rhythm of feasting and fasting. Now, it's not right to say don't eat or drink anything, or not very much. There are times when eating and drinking, the latter especially in moderation, are appropriate. God commanded the people of Israel to observe several annual feasts in celebration and remembrance of things that he'd done for them. So, for example, Passover celebrates God's faithfulness in delivering the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The festival of Pentecost, prior to it becoming a time where we remember the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, was a time where Israel celebrated God's faithfulness in providing them with another year's harvest. Of course, Israel's story with God develops and becomes more complex, and over time they have further experiences that they memorialize by celebrating feasts. So, for example, Purim becomes a time where they celebrate God's deliverance of the Israelites from the Persian official Haman, who had tried to wipe them out. And Hanukkah becomes a celebration of the freedom of the Israelites from the rule of Antiochus, who tried to wipe out Israel and desecrated the temple. As Christians, of course, we celebrate Christmas as the time where God became one of us, standing in solidarity with us in the middle of our sin and our pain. And Easter, the time when God demonstrates the depth of his love by giving Jesus for us and the power of God in raising him from the dead. The feasts remind us of the most important parts of our story. But feasts need to be occasional. If we always feast, feasts lose their impact. That's why the biggest feasts in the Christian liturgical calendar are preceded by times of fasting. Advent prior to Christmas and Lent prior to Easter. At these times, we emphasize some types of self-denial because that season of denial, when it's over, helps us to appreciate God's blessings all the more at the time when we celebrate. And we associate those blessings with the joyous celebration of God's goodness towards us. So that's feasting and fasting on a big scale throughout the year. What about on our daily life? Is there something like in our weekly existence that we can build into feasting and fasting? Well, we could, sure. So, for example, you could choose a feast-fast cycle every week. You might say, well, I'm going to choose to eat some plainer food throughout the whole week. No desserts, nothing, none of this stuff. But every Sunday night at dinner time, we are going to sit down as a family and we're going to eat, a feast, roast beef and all this stuff. We're going to have dessert. We're going to enjoy all of that stuff. And it becomes a time of us coming together to be attentive to one another. And the food just becomes a vehicle to do this. Now, I say Sunday dinner. The day is not really all that important. What is important is it's time that people can set aside to be present to one another, not time where everybody feels pressured to eat and run. Another way that we could do this would be to teach ourselves delayed gratification. Maybe, I get the kids down to bed and I feel stressed, and my first impulse might be to turn on the TV and watch a show to help the stress melt away. But what if I say, before I put on the show, I'm going to spend time taking my stress to God in prayer. And maybe I say, you know what, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes praying about my day to God, rather than reaching to the remote control to cope with my stress. Now, I don't mean to say that prayer will magically make the stress melt away, or that 15 minutes of prayer is always adequate. But if we learn to pray first, then we're training ourselves to respond constructively. When our impulse is to reach for something else, then we're training ourselves to deal with our discomfort in a way that can't actually fix our deepest problems. So if you take nothing else away from what I say this morning, I would just ask you to ask yourself 2 questions. The first is, what is more important to me? Food or the one who gives the food and those with whom I eat the food? And the second question is, how do I deal with worry and stress? By seeking God or the gifts that God has given me? The gifts can be life-changing and wonderful as long as they are used properly, but when they take God's place, they don't work that way. So let's learn to seek the giver, not just the gifts that he gives.